Hey folks, welcome to week 14 of DMD 100, Intro to Digital Media Design. Week 14, we are in the home stretch. I hope everybody is doing well and taking good care of themselves. So this week, let's hop over to the syllabus and see what's going on. So normally we would have met on April 27th, 29th, and May 1st. On your own in the background, you guys are working on your final version of your title sequence. By now, of course, you've all gotten feedback on your draft of your title sequence. Hopefully that feedback was helpful. Hopefully you got some feedback from some fellow students as well as the critique that I gave you. So hopefully you're making some changes and updating it and really feeling pretty good about it. The ones that I saw all looked pretty good for the most part. I'm really looking forward to seeing the finals. Now, in terms of timeline, we are, of course, in week 14. This week, we are spending time on our final visual literacy topic, which is semiotics. We'll talk about that in a second. Next week, we have our final media analysis, which is on the topic of design. We'll be looking at pieces of design and analyzing them. And then lastly, in week 16, we will be turning in your final title sequence. So that's pretty much the course of events over the next 3 weeks before we finish things up. Now let's talk a little bit about semiotics. Now semiotics is a fairly complex philosophical system that talks about the communication of symbols and signs, and we've talked about pictograms and graphics as well as logos and simplification of visual imagery, and those sorts of pictograms and graphics play into semiotics, but really what semiotics talks about is what are those symbols and signs talking about? What are they asking us to do? What is the general understanding of what they do? Now, semiotics is fairly complex. You can literally spend an entire semester studying it. But as you can see here by the title, Semiotics Made Simple, we're just going over some of the basics. Now, to be truthful, normally in class I would do this as a big group conversation, and that's really hard to do online, so we won't be doing that. So all I'm really hoping you'll do this week is pay attention to some of the stuff I'm talking about, look at the handouts, and watch these 2 videos. If nothing else, you'll come away from this with just a broad understanding of the introduction of what semiotics is and of the various visual literacy aspects that we've gone over all semester. This is probably the most complex one, which is why I save it for last. Now, if we take a look at the 2 videos, you can find those over in Canvas under announcements. You'll see that there is an announcement that says Semiotics Made Simple, same name as the week's lesson, and there are 2 videos here to watch. I will say they're a little longer than our normal videos. This one here, which is a rather very short introduction to semiotics, is about 21 minutes long, and then this one here, which is a basic semiotics lesson, is about 10 minutes long. Overall, they're not super long, but they will give you a nice overview about what semiotics is all about. So certainly be sure to watch those as sort of your major textbook reading. Also in the week 14 folder, you're going to find these handouts here. There are 5 handouts that is a really nice infographic going over not only the basics of what semiotics is, but also a little history of it, specifically discussing the 2 philosophers philosophers and linguists, I should say. One of them was a philosopher, the other one was a linguist, who basically came up with this entire way of thinking. And this does a nice job of sort of breaking it down into simple pieces. So we'll go over that a little bit in a second, and then you can read through the rest of it sort of on your own. Now, we did get introduced to this briefly at the very beginning of the semester when we went over all of our basic visual literacy principles. You probably remember the last few we looked at started with this exit sign, right? So this exit sign is referred to as a signifier in the world of semiotics, meaning it is a simple symbol that is telling you to do something, right? And symbols can be made up of basic graphics, they can be made up of pictograms, and they can be made up of letter forms. So we all know what an exit sign is, and this version of an exit sign, of course, is just one of them, but anytime you see an exit sign, it obviously involves the word exit. It generally has the red color in it somewhere, and there's some sort of arrow mechanism happening telling you where to go. Together, that's a symbol, and that symbol is a signifier. right? Now, signifiers, of course, are instructions. They're visual instructions that tell you to do something. So that's the signifier. Now, what it tells you to do, of course, is to leave, right? To exit the building, to exit the room, to exit the space. So the act of actually leaving, of actually exiting, is the signified. So the sign is the signifier, and the act that you then do in response to that is the signified. So that's pretty straightforward, right? That's the absolute easiest way to understand semiotics. There's way more to it than that, but that's a good handle on it. And if you think about it, these sorts of signifiers and signified actions happen a lot when you're driving. If you think about the simple graphics that are used on road signs, whether it be a collection of arrows or symbols or whatnot, all of those are signifiers telling you to merge lanes, or veer left, or right turn only, or stop, or yield, or any number of other things we do while driving that are triggered by seeing these signifiers. They give away what you are supposed to do. Now, some are more complex than others. Nobody really gets too confused about an exit sign. But others, like this, can be a little more complex because of the way the graphic is represented. So this is a signifier. We talked about this at the beginning of the semester. So it's a simple graphic of a person dropping a piece of trash into a trash can. So the signifier is basically saying, throw out your trash, right? Get rid of your trash. But then the confusion comes in into what it's specifically asking you to do. Now, in the actual graphic that's being used as a signifier, it shows sort of a metal wire trash can. Well, that's great, but what if you don't have a metal wire trash can? Is it in fact asking you to do this? Should you put your trash in these metal trash bins? Because that's throwing out your trash. That works nicely. Or is it just caring about the getting rid of the trash, and does it mean just throw your trash in a pile somewhere like this? It probably doesn't mean this, but on the other hand, there's definitely some questions involved. So signifiers have to be really clear or really simple in what they're asking people to do. Because if you take this one literally, if I saw this on a wall somewhere and was walking around with a bag of trash, I just had a sandwich or something and I got a paper bag, I'd be looking around for this metal trash bin. Well, if I don't see them, then my brain has to make the next logical leap. Well, maybe there's a different type of trash can laying around that I can use. And if there's no trash cans at all, well, what am I supposed to do? It's like sometimes you go into public restrooms and it will give you the instructions using pictograms as to how to wash your hands. I saw one recently that basically went through the steps using pictograms, how to wash your hands, and then the final step was to take the paper towel and throw it in the trash can. Sounds great, except this particular bathroom didn't have paper towels. They had air dryers. And so that breaks the cycle. That breaks the instruction that the signifier is trying to tell you. Well, I have no paper towels, so therefore I can't throw them in the trash can. So is that signifier valid? Well, not completely. So anywho, this is the basic sort of premise of what semiotics is all about. Now, clearly there's way more to it than that. Let's take a look a little bit at some of these various segments in this infographic. Again, I would encourage you to take a closer look at this on your own, but let's zoom in and see a couple of them. All right, so these two guys here, Ferdinand de Saussure and Charles Sanders Peirce. Yes, my French is terrible. I apologize for my bad pronunciation. These gentlemen here are really responsible for putting together what we now consider to be semiotics. So the first guy, they both lived roughly in the same time frame. They were peers of each other. Ferdinand was a linguist and Charles was a philosopher. And if you think about what I just explained about semiotics, you can sort of see that it's a merger of both linguistics and philosophy, right? Sort of how we read, what we read, and why we read it. Those three areas really cover semiotics. Again, what we read, which in this case is pictograms or graphics, how we read it, right? And why we read it. What is it telling us to do? This gentleman was Swiss and this gentleman was an American. And you can see here that Ferdinand was responsible for the whole sign, signifier, signified concept, what we just went over. He came up with the idea that certain symbols are telling us to do certain things. And he came up with the syntagam and paradigm concepts. He constructed this two-part model. which is the signifier is the form that the sign takes, like the exit sign that we saw, right? That's the form that it takes. And the signified is the concept that it is trying to show you, what it is asking you to do. So that's his ballpark. Meanwhile, Charles, on the other hand, came up with the idea that we only think in signs and concepts. His theory was that the human brain does not actually think in words, we think in concepts. So some words, some pictures, some graphics, colors, and then if you throw in the other senses like smells and sort of memories of things you've heard or things you've touched, well, what you're really thinking in is sort of concepts and signs. So the signifying thought that anything is a sign if someone interprets it as meaning something other than itself. Now, this is not necessarily like cloud reading or dream interpretation, but an arrow pointing to the right could just be an arrow, or it could mean it wants you to take a right turn, right? So that's basically what we're saying is if we all see an arrow pointing in a particular direction, at this point we're all so trained in semiotics subconsciously that nobody thinks to themselves, oh, look, it's an arrow. Okay, well, that's an interesting arrow. I guess I'll just ignore it. Nobody does that. Everybody goes, oh, I guess I have to go right. If you were driving your car and saw that arrow, you wouldn't just assume, well, it's a nicely drawn arrow. I guess that's fine. No, you would think to yourself, oh, I guess I have to turn right. So that automatic response mechanism to the symbol is sort of built into what we are all about. So both of the philosophies and the systems that these two guys came up with sort of merged together to create semiotics. Now let's take a look at sort of what those basic tools are. So there's denotation and connotation, which we'll get to in a minute. There are the signs, which we'll get to right now. And then syntagms and paradigms. I'm probably pronouncing syntagms wrong. I always mess it up. So let's talk about signifiers and signified again, because we've already gone over it with our example of the exit sign and a trash can. But just a clarifier, right? So the signifiers are the physical forms of a sign, such as a sound, a word, an image, that create communication. Now remember, sounds can also be signifiers, right? If you hear somebody's car horn beeping, well, you assume that they want you to pay attention or get out of the way or stop or something like that. If you hear an alarm sounding in your house, well, maybe it's a fire alarm or a smoke alarm. That's telling you should probably leave the building. So sounds can also be signifiers, not just visual objects. We talk a lot about the visual objects because this is a visual class, but it can also be sounds. Then the signified is the meanings or thoughts that the sign represents, that the audience has to interpret through connotation. We'll get to that in a second. And most of that happens through shared experience, right? Nobody sits you down as a child and says, listen, this sign means this symbol means this. It usually comes naturally over time, either from observing other people's behavior or from people explaining it to you piecemeal along the way. Okay, next. Now we have denotation and connotation. Let's talk about what that's all about. So a denotation is the physical object that we actually see that makes up the form of communication, right? From the image below, it can be denoted that there is a black circle, right, which there is, which serves as the background, and the word dog is dropped out in white on it. So if we never knew what a dog was, if you can't read the word dog, if you have no idea what this is, all you could possibly say is there's a black circle with 3 white letters on top of it. That's it. You're done, right? But because we can read the word dog, that takes us to the next level of understanding. And then because we can read the word dog, that immediately pulls up all sorts of images in your head about what a dog is. Now, those images in your head are not necessarily good or bad. In fact, if anything, they're neutral until your personal experience colors them. Meaning, if you're a dog lover, and you love dogs, and you have dogs, and you're a big fan of dogs, then as soon as you see this symbol, it's going to trigger pictures in your brain that are going to be positive, like this graphic of a dog here with a little heart over his head. So that's the connotation. So the denotation is the physical object that says dog, and then what happens after that is individualized. Some people, the connotation will be, oh, I love dogs, they're adorable, they're great. However, for other people, it might not be so good, like this mailman running away from an angry dog. Or maybe you're allergic to dogs, or maybe a dog bit you once, or maybe you're just more of a cat person and don't care about dogs. So the connotation is highly individualized. So regardless of what you see, that can all be exactly the same, but how we interpret it, the connotation we get out of it, is entirely individualized. You can think of lots of other examples too, I'm sure. Okay, moving on. Then we've got the idea of syntagms and paradigms. Now these are a little more complex, right? And these talk about a lot of word usage, but we'll go through it anyway. So syntagms are the building blocks of communication. Connecting these building blocks enables complex communication such as language. Now prior to this, we've been talking about graphics and symbols and things that are not heavy on language. Even this one over here is just a simple one-syllable word, dog. But of course, things get more complex the deeper you get into language, right? For example, the words in the sentence, "the cat sat on the mat," are all syntagms. For an image, the syntagm would be elements such as composition, color, lighting, etc. What we understand from these depends on the connotations we have. So it's similar to this in that if you see the symbol dog, you might think differently about a dog depending on your experience with dogs. You might have a positive experience with dogs, you might have a negative experience with dogs. However, if you read a more complex sentence like "the cat sat on the mat," what are you picturing in your head? Is it something funny? Is it something serious? Is it something good or bad? All of these things have to do with your experiences. And then, of course, paradigms work similar to connotation in that it has a lot to do with what your background is and what you think about these things. Okay, and then moving on, let's talk about icons, symbols, and indexes. These three are all related. An icon has a physical resemblance to something that is being signified. It looks like the thing that you are being told it is, or that you're being asked to do. So, for example, a stop sign is not an icon, right? A stop sign is a red octagon with the word stop on it. It doesn't look like stopping. It just tells you it's stopping. So that, in fact, is what you call a symbol, right? So a stop sign is a symbol. It doesn't look like actually stopping, but we know that it means stopping. Meanwhile, this graphic of this mustache looks like a mustache, so it's an icon. So this icon resembles a mustache, in this case an old 1800s curly type mustache like this guy has. And you can think of other things like this, right? So it looks like the thing that it represents, but in very simple form, right? Meanwhile, symbols, it's the opposite of an icon. So it doesn't actually resemble the thing that it's representing. Instead, they are sort of general or simplistic, and they generally are learnt culturally, which explains why cultures can develop unique traits, meaning symbols that work in one part of the world don't necessarily work in other parts of the world, right? So those are symbols. And then the last one of the three is an index. So the index describes the physical connection between the signifier and the signifier. This means that the signifier cannot exist without the physical presence of the signified, right? An example of this is that smoke can't exist without fire. At least that's the general concept, right? So if you have a graphic of fire and then you see smoke, well, that is an index because it makes sense that they're linked together. Okay, now I realize that a lot of these are very vague and there's a lot of crossover between them. Icons are the same as pictograms and so on and so forth. But I just want you to try to wrap your head around these things and just sort of understand where they come from. And that ultimately these are just attempts to understand how people communicate in non-writing format, right? In sort of visual formats or in simplistic graphic-based formats. Watch the two videos. That'll certainly help flesh it out a little bit more. And then you can stick that tool in your toolbox. All right, and then that's our last visual literacy tool for the semester. Just try to soak in it for a little while. And like I say, if you are really into it, you're welcome to do more research. But if not, at least I got to introduce you to the concept. Okay, for the rest of the week, of course, keep working on your final version of your title sequence. If you need help, if you get stuck, if you want to show me something, shoot me an email, and I will be happy to help you.